Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into this episode of the Spook Notes podcast, where we get academic about everything that goes bump in the night. I'm Marlena.
And I'm Connor.
And on today's episode, we will be talking about...
the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Dun dun dun!
So, released in 1974, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was directed by Tobe Hooper and follows a group of friends who fall victim to a family of cannibals while they're kind of road tripping around the back roads of Texas trying to find an old homestead of theirs and see if their grandpa was exhumed from his grave.
Yeah, that's pretty much a good synopsis of the film. You know, just give you guys a little brief background on what it actually is.
And we'll get more into that later.
Yeah.
So,
stay tuned.
So basically, this movie, we'll run down a few of the reviews. It has a 7.5 on IMDb, an 88% on Rotten Tomatoes. It got a 2.4 score on RogerEbert.com. The thing about this movie is that when it was released, most reviewers hated it for its violent content, which was something that a lot of horror movies were getting during that time and through the 80s. Some people called it despicable, like some people wanted it banned or censored.
And that was simply due just because of the amount of gore and brutality of all the, I guess, kills in the movie, right? Because people weren't necessarily exposed to that kind of, bodily horror.
Well, really, but I feel like it's more about the implied violence, because there's actually really little on-screen violence and on-screen blood, and most of it is implied, most of it is left up to the imagination. I mean, when you think about when the girl gets put on the hook, you don't see anything entering her or even any blood. You just see the hook, and then you see Leatherface bring her to the hook, and there's nothing actually shown on screen, so it's left up to your imagination, which is in a way, I think, almost worse.
Yeah, no, that is true. That is true. Because I guess it's subjective, right? Like, everybody can kind of interpret it in their own way. And so people who are more sensitive with that type of, I don't want to say graphic content, because like you said, you don't necessarily see it, but if it's implied, everybody can have a different reaction to it. And that kind of goes along with what Connor was saying about how some of the people viewed it as being despicable, and those could be a more sensitive audience.
Which I think what a lot of people were during that time.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads into what my next point is that in later years, in the last 20 or so years, the film has become widely praised and is nowadays considered one of the greatest horror films ever made.
It's kind of like a cult classic, right? You gotta see it.
It's certainly a classic of the genre for sure. I mean, when people make lists of the best horror movies, I feel safe to say that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is usually put in the top 10 for sure.
Oh yeah, top 10 slasher easily. He's one of the most infamous ones, right?
Certainly. One famous quote that I found was that Stephen King, after the movie was released, said that he would happily testify to its redeeming social merit in any court in the country.
Oh jeez, this is coming from our...
This is coming from
the
king of horror.
Yeah. Jeez, for him to even say that. Well,
he has he says so many things about so many horror movies. Like, on a side note, a little bit of a tangent, but when the Evil Dead was first released, it wasn't getting a lot of press or praise, and he said that the movie was really original and he really loved it, and then that was put on all the posters and used as the main marketing tools. Stephen King said it was good, so it must be good.
Jeez. Well, then you gotta go watch it if the king himself deems it as good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So now I thought we'd go into a little bit of background, a little bit of history on the movie. So it was directed by Tobe Hooper, the late Tobe Hooper, who actually died just this past summer.
Aww. Well, a moment of silence for Hooper.
A moment of silence.
My boy.
Yeah, I mean, he's very prominent in the horror field. He directed this film. He directed Salem's Lot, a Stephen King film. One of the first, actually. He directed, or mostly directed, Poltergeist, as well as a number of others, like The Funhouse. But this was the first major film of Tobe Hooper's career, the first to get a major release. He had made other movies prior to this. One that I believe was called Eggshells, which is basically a hippie movie, and definitely a lot of the ideas and characters from that movie are brought over into this movie.
Hmm.
So, an interesting fact about Toby Hooper is that he worked at I can't remember which university, but a university in Texas, and while working there, he met many of the cast and crew that would come to work on this movie. Um,
That's actually really cool. You know how he kind of goes there and he's like, "Hey, you want to star in this movie?"
I mean, yeah, it was certainly very low budget. In fact, it was made for less than $300,000, and it was made in rural Texas, and during an especially hot summer in 1973,
Jeez.
which is something we may get to later. One thing I didn't talk to you about this before, but it's a little fun anecdote. The company that funded this movie was actually money laundering company front for the mob. And,
no way.
And because of that, many of the
Jesus.
people involved in the movie, many of the actors and crew members, didn't see a lot of return for this, except for Hooper. And many people who were involved in the film resent it for that. I mean, if you think about it, none of the people, aside from Toby Hooper, really went on to have any kind of career after this.
Well, yeah, obviously. Holy smokes, I literally didn't know that. That's a really interesting fact.
Yeah, so we're going to get into our first big point here, but before we do, I just wanted to mention that basically this film is reported to be based on a true story, even though that's not 100% true, and Toby Hooper was inspired to do this because of the time which this movie was made, which was the end of the Vietnam War and Watergate and that kind of thing, and Hooper felt that the news, while depicting a lot of graphic content, was lying to him a lot. He felt the government was lying to him, and that's why he decided to call this a true story, because he was used to all the lies at that point, and this was just another one of those lies that he experienced. But there is another true story aspect of that we're going to get into now.
Yeah, so as Connor was saying, Toby Hooper, he revolutionized the genre of horror with this inspired, and I'm doing air quotes right now, inspired by true events statement. So this was actually played at the beginning of the movie, and audience took it literally after the film's release that there was a crazed maniac wielding a chainsaw massacring innocent peoples. So, however, the dates that were presented at the beginning of the film did not necessarily match up to the film's release date, and it was actually said to be the event of the massacre that happened in the movie. In order for it to kind of coincide with the real events, would have to have happened after the film's release. So this relieved people a little bit, being that, like, you know, it wasn't actually, like, fully based on a true story. However, the origin of the film was said to be loosely based on the real-life serial killer, Ed Gein. My boy. So before...
The serial killer is your boy.
My boy.
Oh my god.
A bad boy. With an I. Before we get into the similarities of the life of Ed Gein and Leatherface, I want to give you a bit of a breakdown of who this real horror show man actually was. So Ed Gein, my boy, was born in 1906 in Plainfield, Wisconsin, to George and Augusta Gein. So Ed actually had a brother named Henry that we will later be talking about in relation to a certain event that happened with Ed. So the Gein family lived in a secluded farm. His father, George, was actually an alcoholic who was heavily despised by his mom, Augusta. So the mom in the Gein household actually wore the pants in the relationship and was viewed as being the head of the house. So the mother forbade the boys from making any friends and said that the boys would never ever be loved by a woman. So obviously, you know, Augusta is is an abusive mother in the Gein household.
Not the best parenthood.
Yeah, not exactly the best role model. And neither was the father, George, being an alcoholic, and he's kind of just, I guess, a lowlife and, you know, didn't really have that much of an impact. So Augusta was actually strict, very strict with Bible and prayer, and her biblical teachings had a tremendous impact on how Ed actually viewed women and sexuality. So this and later would kind of
reflect on the things he did later.
Yeah. So, and we'll get into that. Don't you worry. So, in 1940, Ed's father died to an alcohol-related heart failure. And that didn't have too much impact on Ed or his brother or even the mother, so that's kind of sad. However, 4 years later, Henry's brother died. And this was...
Ed's brother died. Henry.
Oh, yeah. Ed's brother died, which is Henry. So Henry died. And this is kind of where the story starts to take a more sinister turn. And a lot of events were kind of reflected on Ed that he actually murdered his brother. There was a lot of suspicion there, so this kind of could be the first case of Ed Gein, murdering people, or his brother, right? I didn't go into too much research as to actually why he would murder him, but I'm assuming he probably would want to be closer with his mother. I don't know.
There's the kind of upbringing he had.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly right, And
it's hard to understand why Ed Gein did any of the things he did, but certainly we can imagine that his mother had a lot to do with it.
Well, he went through a lot of, abuse and turmoil as a child, so obviously that would be reflected, throughout his life, and especially in early, adulthood or even childhood. So, after his brother died, Ed was left alone with his mother and his mother's insanity for the next 5 years until she actually died in December of 1945. So even though Ed had an abusive relationship with his mother, he was devastated when she died. Because in the Gein family, Augusta was kind of like the head of the house, right? So she was the one in power. So
she was idolized.
Yeah, she was idolized. She was, a figure of power. So obviously Ed was kind of devastated that she died. And after Ed's mother's death, Ed actually became obsessed with ideas revolving around Nazis and cannibals. And those two aren't exactly the best of all things to become obsessed with. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So after the November 16th, 1957 disappearance of the hardware store owner Bernice Warden, police began to suspect Ed, who was the last person to see her alive. So this kind of talks about the first official murder that Ed Gein inflicted on somebody. So police searched the family farm where they found Bernice's decapitated body hanging upside down in the barn. On a further search of the property, authorities also found various human remains, including a trash can made out of a human skull, chairs covered in human skin, and skull bedposts. Wow, I gotta call this guy to remodel my room. Holy smokes.
I mean, there were so many things that they found.
Yeah.
I've heard things all the way up to lampshades made of human skin, a belt made of female nipples, and all of this stuff is stuff that he had exhumed from cemeteries and stuff. And they even found out that he had, after his mother died, boarded up a room with her in it to kind of preserve her in an idolized state.
Yeah, that is also kind of whack, that you'd actually preserve a room fully and board it up and almost like a shrine to her, right?
Very religious.
Yeah, exactly. So perhaps the trait that most linked Ed back to Leatherface was his fondness for turning human skin into apparel. Among the other remains, the police also found a corset, leggings, masks, and a dress, all made from the skin of young women.
And I think that's what makes Ed Gein such a terrifying serial killer, is that we don't really know how many people he killed or
mutilated and tortured. Oh, God.
He's a weird guy.
Yep. My boy's a weird one. I need to stop calling him that. He's not a friend to have. Okay.
So, Ed was arrested on November 21st, 1957, and he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Found mentally incompetent, Ed was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. On November 7th, 1968, doctors determined that Ed was capable of standing trial, and he was found guilty on November 14th. A second trial regarding his sanity found that he was once again not guilty by reason of insanity. There's a lot of flip-flopping back and forth of whether or not this guy was insane. I mean, Well, I feel like
certainly
back in the day,
if they found the people mutilated like that, couldn't they kind of like infer that this guy is like not okay?
the thing is that back in the day, they sent a lot of people to insane asylums that just weren't desired by the rest of society.
Yeah.
So that's what makes it really scary. So after this, Ed was returned to the Central State Hospital, where he died on July 6, 1984. He's buried in Plainfield Cemetery, where his grave is routinely vandalized.
I wonder why.
I mean, yeah, I feel like that's poetic justice.
Yeah, clearly. So obviously, there are a lot of similarities between Ed and Leatherface. Number one, being the love for human flesh and skin wearing, which is kind of seen between both characters, or not characters, both.
The real life character and the fictional one.
Exactly. So in the there's another similarity that's present in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Number one being the room upstairs that was actually devoted to Leatherface's grandparents, much like how Ed had a room devoted to his mother, and they both wanted it to remain exactly the same, and both are boarded up.
So the Leatherface family kind of resembles that of Ed's. Kind of an abusive, mean father, a weird, rebellious brother. Leatherface it's interesting because Leatherface, in a way, almost takes the role of both Ed and the mother, being that Leatherface puts on different masks in the movie, two of which are quite feminine and represent kind of a maternal, motherly aspect to him.
Yeah. Especially the one he wears during the dinner scene. When Sally's there and they're all like kind of, the whole family's gathered. The mask he chooses to wear actually has makeup on it. So it's very interesting to see that he's, kind of embodying a woman character.
And that mask is called the Pretty Woman mask.
Ooh, slay girl.
It's funny that one thing that most people don't notice, that I didn't notice until many years after watching the movie, is that Leatherface actually wears 3 different masks in the movie. His original killer mask when he kills all the kids, his pretty lady mask that he wears during the dinner scene. But for one quick scene before that, when they're preparing dinner, Leatherface is actually wearing like this old grandmother's mask.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not notice that. That is very interesting.
And I think it's called the Hag or something.
Oh, God.
And then the final similarity between the two is they both had rooms littered with bones, skin, and other debris.
Yeah.
In the case of Leatherface, it's chickens.
Man likes some chicken.
So, one final thing I want to touch on about the making of the film before we move on is that the making of the film was notorious for being extremely tough and arduous on the cast and crew. Like I said, it was extremely hot summer in August of 1973
in Texas.
In Texas, and during the filming of the dinner scene, they actually had to film that all in one day, so it took 26 hours to film.
Oh my God!
Which meant that even though it was all supposed to be happening at night, during the day they actually had to cover the windows with black carpets, which meant that the heat in the room got even more extreme. And I've heard it got up to like 125 degrees.
Wow.
And what makes it worse is that there was, in the dinner scene, you can see that there's a lot of meat on the table, which was real meat, and rotted incredibly quickly, which meant that there was a horrific stench in the room combined with the heat.
So essentially, it's like being in Leatherface's house.
Exactly.
It's stanky.
Crew members were reported to have to run out, puke, and run back in to continue to do their job. And then the probably most scary aspect is Gunnar Hansen, the actor who played Leatherface, apparently near the end of the shooting, when everybody was at their wit's end, momentarily lost sight of what he was doing and actually cut actress Marilyn Burns. And her real blood in the scene where Grandpa sucks the blood from her finger
was actually her.
That's her blood from a cut.
Oh my God.
That Leatherface made.
I hope they compensated those actors well. Jesus.
They didn't. Remember? Because of the whole mafia front thing?
Oh, yeah. Oh my God.
But, it all made a great movie.
Yeah, it sure did. One that we're talking about today.
So, I thought we would kind of give our own opinions on the movie. I mean, do you want to go first?
Well, straight up, I really like the movie. For all of its different aspects, whether that be the the gory scenes or the unseen violence, your interpretation of it. But one thing I really did like was the use of the different camera angles in the movie. Number one, being when they film the dinner scene and they kind of zoom in on Sally's face, and you can kind of see her eyes going frantically, and it creates that sense of like uneasiness and anxiety, right? And that's what I really like, because that's what kind of gets me like on edge. I'm like, oh my god, like, because you can't see everything, you can only see certain parts. And I like the way they film the scenes of the barn and the farm, and I don't know, just seeing the landscape, and it kind of
There's a lot of wide shots.
Yeah, and it kind of reinforces the isolation aspect of it, because you see those wide angle shots, you see all the the distance in the background, and
where there's just nothing.
Yeah, where there's just nothing. So it's that, I guess, that duality of, right? Because you have that close-up shot of her face, but then you also have that wide angle shot as well.
Well, it's kind of like when they're outside the house, the landscape of Texas stretches on forever. Mm-hmm. But when they're inside the house, it's Sally, Leatherface, and the rest of his family. It's intimate and it's harsh.
Yeah.
And there's nothing else.
That's right. Well, what did you think about the film?
Well, I mean, I love it. It's one of my favorite horror movies of all time. One thing that I absolutely love about it, probably the thing that makes me rewatch it again and again, is how it has an almost documentary quality to it. Like, I feel like if I didn't know anything about it and somebody said, this is a real thing that actually happened, I'd believe it. Well, not really, because I know there's obviously people behind the camera, but
yeah,
it feels like it could be real. It feels like something that you would see in science class.
Yeah.
Be like, this is the anatomy of insanity.
Oh gosh, I would love to have watched that in science class. That would have that would have made my class so much better.
I was about to say. All right, so now I thought we'd get into the main crux of what we're going to be talking about today. Before I start, I'd just like to say that while this was made during the end of the Vietnam War and during that period in time, so there's definitely that at least unintentional subtext going on. It's up for debate how much of this kind of message Hooper intentionally put in the film. So I just want to keep that in mind, not saying that. So while I talk about this, I'm not going to be saying that Hooper meant for all this to be read into, but it's certainly something that can be read into.
Mm-hmm.
So, basically, my main argument for what I think this movie is about is, it's basically, in my opinion, the age-old story of old-fashioned working-class lifestyle at war with new, forward-thinking, and liberal ideas. Boiled down, it's tradition versus technology. Basically, I think that the film works very well as an American film. Obviously, it's a horror classic no matter where you live. But the reason I think it's such a good American film, and why the Texas part of it is so important, is because, as I said, it's tradition versus technology. But in its most raw form, I also think it's basically a metaphor for Republican versus Democrat. An issue that's been around in America as long as it's existed. Mm-hmm. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that the hippies in this movie represent Democrats, and the cannibalistic family represents the Republicans. So, the main argument for this is that the movie was made during the end of the Vietnam War, which was a war started by a Republican president, which was a war that, when this movie came out, Richard Nixon was the president, a president who regularly lied to the people, who regularly abused his power, and the reflection of that is in this movie. And not only was it a war started by a Republican president, but it was a war that was protested heavily by free-loving hippies during the early 70s, the 60s as well.
Yeah, because they really didn't want to be conscripted to go and join this war. They were all about, I'm free, I can do whatever I want, please don't tell me what to do, I'm going against the government.
Anti-establishment.
Exactly.
So, that's why I think that the hippies in this movie, the kids, represent that movement. They are in a van during the movie. They are moving away from whatever society maybe behind them and moving to the outskirts. They're moving away from
Whatever.
Whatever power might be in the
Yeah.
city. They're
Yeah.
they're trying to leave that behind. But the flip side of that is what they find out in the wilderness, in the rural areas, is so much worse.
Yep. It is
than-
literal. It's literally the physical embodiment of conservative political party, and Connor's going to go more into depth about that.
Exactly. So the hippies, one thing that a lot of people during that time kind of resented the hippies for is they saw that they kind of felt that the hippies were pushing their beliefs and thoughts and opinions on others, and going places and doing things that they weren't wanted, which is exactly what happens in this movie. They go to somewhere where they aren't wanted and face the consequences of that. So if the hippies in this movie represent liberal, democratic ideas, the cannibals are the flip side of that, and represent conservative, old-fashioned minded Republican Party leaders who, in this film, literally feast on the young of America, and in real life, feasted on the young of America by conscripting them, sending them to Vietnam, sending them off to die.
Almost like animals.
Like animals.
In a way, yeah.
Exactly. You could say in real life, the Republicans were treating, the youth of America like meat, and the cannibals in this family literally treat them like meat. So, I think that that's where the main conflict of this movie stems from. The conflict between those two sides, that I don't think either of them is entirely right, and either of them is entirely wrong. The other thing that I think drives this movie is not only just Republican versus Democrat, but is kind of again, tradition versus technology. The cannibals resent technology because it's what drove them away from work. It's what drove them into poverty. There's a line in the movie basically where the hitchhiker says, like, the air gun's no good. You got to use the sledge. And what that's referencing is that they worked in a slaughterhouse where cows were killed routinely and very kind of like
manually, almost.
Conveyor belt.
Yeah.
So in the past, basically, they would have somebody who was the person working the sledge or the hammer that would kill the cows, and they needed somebody to be good at it because, you can't have a cow that's bucking like crazy and going around everywhere.
Yeah. So they got to know what they're doing.
They have to know what they're doing, which is implied is what the cannibal family used to do, especially the grandpa. Mm-hmm. But then what was introduced is the air gun. So the air gun was a machine that could kill the cow instantaneously with no mess and no skill involved. You just put it to a cow's head and they're dead. Mm-hmm. That kind of invention pushed the cannibals out because they were no longer needed. They were obsolete. So that's why they kind of resent this technology.
Yeah, and you could essentially, with this new technology, employ anybody that could do it. Essentially, it's an air gun. You can just pull the trigger and then the animal is dead. Whereas with the sledgehammer, you had to have some skill, some previous knowledge behind that, right? So it kind of, that conflict of old school, I don't want to say technology, but technology as opposed to innovation and newer technology.
Forward thinking,
exactly.
Which, it all circles back. And there's also the suggestion, and again, none of this is like outrightly said, but I think there's a suggestion that the reason that this family started eating flesh is because they had no means to get anything. They had been destroyed by the capitalist system and now had to procure their meat elsewhere.
Yeah.
As you could say. The reason I say this is because there's even a line that the cook says in the movie where basically he says something along the lines of, I don't take any pleasure in killing. There's just some things you gotta do. So, they don't really see themselves as the bad guys. They just see themselves as, this is just something I gotta do.
Well, yeah, like, you gotta eat. It's a necessity of life, so they're gonna go to any means to get it. And since they have such, I guess, a low view of, well, in this case, liberals, they don't really care, right? They don't really feel that that guilt if they're killing somebody like a human, right? They're no different from an animal. So they need to sustain themselves that way.
And I think one scene that is an especially good representation of this kind of conflict between the two sides here is when the grandpa character is trying to kill Sally with the hammer.
Yeah.
He is kind of like coming down on her again and again, but not really able to kill her necessarily. Which, I mean, in my opinion, I take that as a metaphor for the government literally hammering down these youth, trying to hammer them into submission.
Shape them into what they want them to be.
Hammer them into submission, exactly. But at the same time, I think that because Sally ultimately does survive and she escapes, it is kind of the idea that maybe there is still a spirit left in these people and they can push through, push past adversity.
Mm-hmm.
So while I think that this film is largely a negative film, and I believe, because Marlene, you'd asked me this earlier, what side you think this movie takes, the liberal or conservative kind of side, the Democratic Republican, I think it kind of parodies both, the extremes of both sides of the political scale.
Yeah.
And one thing that we haven't mentioned yet, but is worth mentioning because I feel like we've talked pretty badly about Republicans, is that this film was also came out around the time of Charles Manson, which he is the other side of the coin, the other end of the scale, where he is hippie culture run amok at its absolute worst. So basically, in the sense, hippie culture, well, it's more than just this. It's free-loving, we can do whatever we want kind of spirit. We don't need an establishment telling us what to do. So
however, with Charles Manson, he was at the very end of the spectrum of a liberalist view because he thought, well, I can do whatever I want, including killing people. And that's what really crosses the line and sets him apart.
Exactly. So, that's why I think that this film it was in a time where both extremes were bad and this film takes a almost kind of cold, calculated approach to either where it says that both are wrong. Both are kind of, you need a balance. You need a medium somewhere in there.
Yeah, you can't be severely left-wing and severely right-wing and think that's okay. Like you said, there has to be a healthy medium in between.
Exactly.
Or nobody kills each other, because that shit's not good.
Exactly. So one final thing that I thought, actually two things that I kind of wanted to say is that, one, as we talked about earlier, I think that the other thing that this film does is it kind of parodies the traditional conservative nuclear family.
Oh yeah, 100% for sure.
The cannibals are a perversion of that. Like I said, you have the rebellious teenager and the hitchhiker. You have the overbearing father and the cook. You have the patriarchal figure above all and grandpa. But the perversion comes from Leatherface, who's kind of like this weird amalgamation of a maternal figure, a protector / guardian for the family, but also kind of abused and oddly sexualized because he wears the makeup in some sort of weird attempt to look pretty.
Mm-hmm.
He kind of fits the empty roles where there's no females in this family, so he has to fill all those roles. So it is definitely a perversion of
femininity
and the nuclear family.
Yeah, and that also kind of relates to Ed Gein as well, because he also had a very perverted sense on being a woman, and he tried to embody that as well when he was creating the masks made of women parts and stuff like that. It's very grotesque for sure.
And the final bit of subtext and themes I thought we'd talk about is kind of the treatment of meat in this film. One thing that I found interesting is Tobe Hooper said in an interview that while making this movie, he decided to become a vegetarian.
Well, after working on set and smelling all that rotting meat, oh Jesus, I would be too.
Yeah, you can certainly see why.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
But I mean, just this film can be read almost as a pro-vegetarian veganism film, because the treatment of meat in this film, it's not treated like how you see in like cooking shows where it's very like elaborate and almost kind of There's a ritualistic aspect to it.
It's kind of like portrayed as being in its simplest form, just slabs of flesh, that's all it is.
Exactly. And the other way you can look at it is it's almost like we kill these animals in the slaughterhouse, the cows, the pigs, very kind of with no feeling, no remorse. What happens if that was you? That's what this movie is.
Yeah, and exactly. That's kind of reflected on the characters in the movie because they're treated as if they're animals and they're used to sustain the cannibalistic family. So that's messed up.
I mean, I feel like this could almost be a documentary of what it's like to work in a slaughterhouse, but replace all the pigs with humans. You got somebody being killed by the hammer. You got a girl being hung up on a meat hook.
Yep.
You got a girl being put into a freezing locker for later.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that you can definitely take that kind of view in the movie that it is almost a pro-vegetarian movie in a weird way. Which is not something you would regularly think about from a horror movie.
Well, yeah, from a slasher movie, right? It's like, go vegan, I'm vegan.
So to kind of end this off, I think that the main themes that we've kind of looked at in this movie are the theme of isolation, the theme of both literal and metaphorical cannibalism, class themes, political themes, and then the vegetarian-vegan themes. Yeah. So, I don't know, did you want to talk about some of the main fears that the film touches on?
Well, yeah, the ones that we noticed right off the bat was being somewhere that you don't belong. And that can kind of be seen through, the hippies that are kind of going into the cannibalistic farmhouse because this is not somewhere that they're supposed to be. And the cannibals make that really obvious and they, don't want them there, so they try to kill them. And that kind of, like, coincides with being consumed, right? That's another human fear, is, like, being bodily consumed, like having somebody, I guess, eat you, right? That's another fear.
I mean, that's terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeez, I flip out when mosquitoes, like, eat me. I can't imagine this family going ham on me. No pun intended. And lastly, the one that is the most obvious is violence and bodily harm, and that can be seen through the different, grotesque mannerisms that Leatherface is killing his victims by, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, I mean, I think that kind of wraps up our discussion on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. If you have any thoughts or opinions on what you think the movie might be about, or kind of a different opinion from what you think we've kind of read into it, please do send us an email.
Or feel free to comment. Yeah, we definitely will love to read your guys' comments, We want to hear what you think. If you agree with some of our opinions, if you have some of your own opinions, feel free to share.
And yeah, and like I said, you can email us at
spooknotes@gmail.com.
Is Spooknotes podcast?
No, it's really, Connor. It's spooknotes@gmail.com.
I'll send you an email.
Yeah, we'll shoot you up. Don't you worry. And as always, you can follow us on the 3 major platforms. We have iTunes, we have it on SoundCloud, and we have it on YouTube. As always, all the links will be provided below. YouTube. 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 Bono will be there. I don't know. Do you have any closing remarks, Connor?
Well, I just think that this is a really interesting film, and while at first you may look at this film just as kind of like
typical
a weird
slasher.
exploitation slasher film, it really does, I feel like, have a lot of subtext that you can read into.
And on that note, thanks for listening, and don't forget to cite the spook notes. Bye!